Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the sick Solipsist. I apologize for my state of my voice. And this week, I watched Crazy Rich Asians from 2018. Now, this is a movie that I was definitely aware of when it came out, and I heard some varied responses when it came out. Some people who praised it quite a bit, and some people who said, oh, it's just another rom-com, or it's, not that deep, or it's got problematic stuff in it, or whatever. And I wasn't particularly interested in it in the first place, but I don't remember exactly the reason why I sort of pushed it off my list. However, it came up in conversation very recently, and I decided it was probably a good idea to give it a look. It's actually longer than I expected. For a rom-com, it strikes me as quite long at just over 2 hours. But it is certainly unique in a lot of ways. On its release and with all the PR that was going on with it, it was being lauded. We'll get to the details of this later, but lauded for having an all-Asian cast. That is something that is still a problem. Racial representation in Hollywood especially, and in media and movies in general, continues to be a huge problem. So on its face, having an all-Asian cast, an ensemble cast, in a movie that is performing well and received relatively well, is absolutely a positive thing. Now, rom-coms aren't really my thing, not because of, I think I've talked about this before on the show, but not because of any particular dislike of them, just because they tend to be very formulaic and not particularly engaging at some point. That's not to say I don't like them in general. There are a few in particular that I really love that are very high on my list of favorite movies, but they are few and far between. And fascinatingly, this does not fall into a lot of the typical pitfalls of a classic rom-com. Rom-coms are also sort of a genre that has somewhat died out, in a lot of ways replaced by sort of the, let's say, Judd Apatow comedies. The Judd Apatow style comedies have really supplanted the rom-com space by having some small amount of romantic quality to them. And then as far as the rom-coms of the 90s and 2000s, those have really largely disappeared, at least that I've noticed. So it's fascinating to see this movie that is both trying to tell a somewhat different story from a typical rom-com, but has a different focus as well. This is based on a novel, a series of novels, as I understand it, that I have not read, but apparently are pretty decent as well. And it focuses on this movie focuses on a Chinese American woman who has a successful career. Here's where we get into the rom-com usuals. Has a successful career in as a professor, and a boyfriend who she does not know is incredibly wealthy and the heir to a very large fortune and business empire. When you phrase it out that way, it is very typical feeling in its rom-comness. The take you away from this kind of plot line. However, it largely shirks that kind of typical plot, and is focused on some very different themes more reminiscent to some of the other movies that I've watched recently, talking about cultural backgrounds and generational trauma, and how acceptance and being in or out of a social group can be really traumatizing to all involved. What bothers me somewhat about the film is that it doesn't seem to address this that much. The with at over 2 hours, the plot is very thin on the ground from the beginning. The hook is definitely there. The very, basically the very one of the very first scenes is of the two main characters who are or the main character and her boyfriend, who are suddenly being spied on, and then by these socialites in New York, and then information gets back to families in Singapore, and then it's a whole thing, and it gives us the hook for the remainder of the thing, that that the main character is not aware of who she's dating and what she's getting into. It does thankfully avoid the big blow up fight, the trope of the big blow up fight where, oh, you're the worst, I hate you, blah 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 blah, how dare you lie to me. Like, it's got a little bit of that, but in a very reasonable way, in a very non rom-com way. And so they avoid that particular rom-com pitfall of the breakup followed by the being reunited. But from then on, there is very little plot development until the last third of the film, and the plot on the whole is very thin on the ground. It really spends about half to 2/3 of the total runtime showing off Crazy Rich Asians, basically. It shows off this very wealthy subsegment of the 1% or higher of these people who are living in Singapore, and also working in Hong Kong and around in these various very high wealth metropolitan areas. Excuse me. And it does manage to balance this out. The pacing is not really a problem. This is the kind of thing that feels like it should have a pacing problem, because it spends so much time sort of wallowing in the wealth. But he manages to do it in a way that's paced very well. And until I finished the film, I was sort of distracted from just how much of the film had been spent doing that. So it's not unwelcome, and it is well produced in order to set the stage for the story that they want to tell. However, I have some problems with the story that they want to tell, because it is it doesn't go very far. The plot summary is extremely brief. To give me 15 seconds here if you don't want to hear it, but it's Asian American woman goes to Singapore, is not approved by rich boy's mother and grandmother, thinks that she's going to leave him because she wants the best for him, and she wants to show that she's strong enough to go her own way, and then it all comes to the romantic close. That's basically it. there are not that many scenes that directly influence the plot. There are a few additional scenes that get into the mistreatment she receives, and the ways in which she is minorly or majorly slighted, because she is seen as an outsider. And there are a few more beyond that that follow sort of secondary or tertiary threads, showing some of the other people in the cast who have problems of their own in spite of their wealth, and some of the social conflict, the different kinds of social conflicts that have existed as a result. But it doesn't say a lot. It doesn't say a lot about the main character's development, or her arc as a character. For the most part, the movie happens to her. She plays a very passive role. And while I think that is expected to some extent, given the content of the film, that she is a fish out of water who is trying to make nice with people who may not be very accepting, and she's, her throwing a fit or going her own way is not going to serve her well. I still would have liked to see a lot more of her sort of sorting out how she feels about it. Mostly, she is a passive receiver of other people's behavior, rather than having any substantial interaction. Now, that said, there is some very good acting here. I think across the board, the acting is pretty darn solid. But especially from the main couple of characters, there's a lot of subtle body and facial language that tells a lot of story that is not as visible in the language that's being used in the text, so to speak. And I'm very impressed by a lot of the performances in that way. But the overall arc of the film and the way in which it concludes, and the believability of the ending, and the climactic events, and the ways in which that all sort of comes to a satisfying close, I ultimately found to be difficult to believe. It's a little bit too clean. Similar to what I said about Encanto, it's a very similar sort of thing of, we wanted a nice, clean ending, and we are going to glaze over all of the problems that aren't solved here, that are very visibly not solved. And so that's definitely disappointing in that light. However, like I said, I think the casting is very good. I'm just overall very pleased with all of the performances, including some from people who I don't even particularly like, or who I don't have I don't think are particularly nuanced actors. But overall, I think the casting is very solid, and the performances are very good. Obviously, with the movie spending so much time looking at the setting of Singapore, and these very opulent events and places and things, that is all, the production wise, it's very high quality. Some of the actual cinematography work there's a few moments that are quite good. Mostly it's kind of mediocre, and there are some, especially in the early scenes, that are just bad, that just bizarrely lit, and framed in very awkward ways that do not feel like they're cinematic. They feel more like TV, like a shot for TV kind of thing. But on the whole, it's not like so frequent or so distracting that I couldn't sort of get past that. Obviously, I'm glad to see Michelle Yeoh. She's always great. I just want to point her out in particular, given the recent my recent viewing of everything everywhere all at once. And I'm not entirely clear how much this performance got her that job, but like given that she plays a very different kind of character, it's nice to see her in general because she's a great actor all around. In reading about this film after the fact, I was both very surprised. Well, I very disheartened, but not surprised, but also very confused by the apparent controversy that happened about the casting. And it goes sort of two ways on this. Apparently, there was a lot of uproar that despite an quote unquote all Asian cast, there was a lot of complaints from various, well, I don't want to say a lot. I don't know. Obviously, these things get over-reported when they happen, but complaints about some of the casting based on who was cast and their ethnic backgrounds, and whether or not they were a proper fit for the role. Ultimately, this is a Hollywood film. It is not. It's not an independently produced film. It's not an Asian produced film, although I think there is some crossover with some non-American production companies. But it's primarily a Hollywood film. That always leads to some questions of who has what kind of influence, what usually white producer in an upper role may have pushed for one thing versus another. But overall, I had some problems with some things, but not with the casting. We'll get to that in a minute. And so to see the just shocking irony of people complaining that some of the castings were biracial or multiracial or not the right race, like they are not ethnically Chinese for an ethnically Chinese role, which getting into ethnically Chinese is a whole thing because there's lots of different Chinese people, usually first to the Han. But anyway, seeing the art, like this weird that this argument happened at all, the irony of a movie substantially about the prejudices that come from living in a very tight-knit, racially undiverse group, that then the casting gets critiqued for including the wrong kind of Asians is basically what it appears to have been, is like super bizarre and offensive, but also, if you know much about the social politics of Asia as a whole, not that surprising. There's a lot of history, both long-term and short-term, of various different ethnic and political groups having horrible views about each other. This is not unique to Asia, of course, but it is definitely a pronounced thing, that, if somebody is Chinese or Korean or Japanese or Malay or something like that, the views between each other and how they view each other, typically for an older generation, a less less publicly, a less social generation, I guess, to hear people complain about, oh, that race is not all that uncommon. So, am I surprised that there were some outrage and uproar? No. However, that does get into one of my personal problems with it. And I'm sort of two minds about this, which is that this is supposed to be a story about mostly ethnically Chinese people in very high positions of power, and high society, and not including the great racial diversity of a lot of Southeast Asia. Singapore is, well, we could get into hours and hours of discussion of why Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan and why they exist at all, who populates them, and then like their neighboring Southeast Asian states like Malaysia and Indonesia, and in the Indian diaspora and all this. Like, these are all locations that are relatively ethnically diverse. There's a lot of commerce going on there. There's a lot of cultural exchange, and there's a lot of people from a lot of different places who either have been there, who either have come there, more immigrated there for work or to make a new life, or were forced there because of conflicts in history, and so Singapore is a very diverse place full of all different kinds of people, and because this movie focuses basically solely on Chinese people, it is awkward in the same way that it is awkward to watch an older film or a film about an older time in America where the absence of other ethnicities is noticeable, but technically historically may or may not be technically historically accurate. There's definitely some problematic elements. This is the main groups are supposed to be Chinese, and there are people of other ethnicities visible, but almost none of them have any lines. There are it is almost all servants or people just walking around in public or guards. There's one scene that I particularly do not like where there are guards at the gate of a house who are their appearance is played for laughs because I don't know if they might be Sikh, I would guess, but they've got long beards, long hair. They're wearing a turban or a headscarf of some kind, and they're very overtly played as like, ooh, these scary, hairy, dark-skinned guys are here. Why are they here? And it's weird. It's definitely not great. And given the rest of the absence of those characters, non-Chinese characters, it's a little iffy at times. It does really make me wonder who this film is for, because ultimately the story is about a Chinese American woman, and given there is a tendency for rom-coms to fall into a sort of fantasy or escapism, this does not fall into a lot of the same pitfalls that a lot of rom-coms do, but it definitely has some elements of this seems to more be written to appeal to the book, I would presume, and the movie appeal to an American audience who is American audiences in particular do love to watch the rich and famous. The obsession with fame and wealth is palpable in American culture. And so it makes me wonder who this is for, because it would strike me that this story and the way that this is all framed could be seen as very insensitive to your normal citizens of Singapore or a lot of the other comparable areas that are just well, obviously it's not representing racial diversity. It's not representing economic diversity either. And that does wrap around back to my concerns with how much the film actually addresses the themes that it seems to raise. These themes of being an outsider and struggling with your place and trying to fit yourself to a culture that may not want you, or carve out your own niche within that culture to be accepted. And I feel like it doesn't address any of those themes strongly enough that it would feel like anything other than it at no point really condemns much of the behavior of the the people who are supposed to be in the wrong. It doesn't condemn them very hard. It really just says, oh, they're just misguided and just need to kind of have a talking to in order to understand that they should open up. I'm wrapping back around to my point from, like 10 minutes ago, but it's the same kind of thing. Is I wonder what the average Singaporean thinks of a story like this. It is, for all the rom-com things it misses, it definitely falls into the fantasy aspect of just ignoring all of the practicalities of the story that it's telling in favor of telling a love story. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough about this one. I think it's pretty good. It's better than I expected. It is a fun watch for the most part, and it has some genuinely heartfelt moments. It has some problems for sure, but I am glad that it exists and that non-white representation in general is becoming more mainstream and more accepted. And I hope to see that more things are able to hopefully use this as a stepping stone to get more diverse stories into the theaters. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.